Now, I want to talk to you today about the planning of the Easter Rising, by which I mean who planned it, how and when did they plan it, and thirdly, what did they intend their plans to achieve. Now, the question sounds simple, but actually finding the answers is rather more complex. Because you're immediately confronted with the problem that you're trying to unravel the inner workings of a conspiracy, which what the Easter Rising was. It's not just a conspiracy, it's actually a conspiracy within a conspiracy. Because although the Easter Rising was officially planned by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the real work was done by a very small inner group. Literally, you count them on the fingers of one hand. There were 5 men initially. They were Tom Clark, Sean McDermott, Patrick Pearse, Joseph Plunkett, and Ian Kent. Later on, in January 1916, they are joined by James Connolly, the revolutionary socialist and leader of the Irish Citizen Army. And then finally, just a few weeks before the Rising, Thomas MacDonagh comes on board. So the full story was only known to 7 people. And it's that gives the title of Ruth Dudley Edwards' latest book, which looks at these 7 men. It's called The Seven. It's a controversial book that has attracted plaudits and abuse in equal measure, but I think it's well worth looking at. These 7 men, of course, were a hermetically sealed. They were a very secretive group. They kept their secrets very well. This is the first and the last time in Irish Republican Brotherhood the British intelligence does not succeed in planting either a spy or an informer at the upper echelons of the Republican movement. Not only did they keep their secrets well in life, they took them literally to the grave. They didn't, of course, keep any records of their deliberations, and they did not leave any written private material either. It's an immensely successful conspiracy. But we do have material to work with. We have the extensive writings and memoirs of a man called Dermot Lynch, who was the secretary to the Supreme Council of the IRB. We have the memoirs of Kathleen Clark, who was not just the wife and widow of Tom Clark, but she was also his very, very close political confidant. She was one of the few people, literally, I think probably one of the 2 people with whom he shared everything. We have the writings of Dennis McCulloch, who was the president of the Supreme Council of the IRB in 1916. We have also the writings, the extensive writings and memoirs of Bulmer Hobson, who was initially Clark's closest political associate, but when they break with each other in June 1914, that's it. As far as Clark was concerned, Hobson was cast into darkness. The devil incarnate, he called him. Clark was a rather unforgiving man. Once you were either on his side, the side of himself in the revolution, or you were on the other side and you were damned forever. We also have the memoirs of P.S.O. Hegarty, who was an important member of the Supreme Council, and Sean T. O'Kelly, not actually on the Supreme Council, but a very, very close associate of Clark. So from all of that material, we can at least get a broad outline of how this conspiracy evolved. With a lot of evidence, and as they say in the CSI programs, what does the evidence tell us about motive, means, and opportunity? the holy grail of the detective, and I suppose the historical detective as well. In terms of motive, on one level, the Easter Rising is very simple to explain. It happened because a small group of men dedicated their lives to bringing it about. Now, I mentioned those 7. And here I think you should make a distinction between fame and importance. The historic face of 1916 is Patrick Pearse. He's the commander-in-chief, he's the president, he's the person who reads out the proclamation, he's the person who delivers the surrender to the British forces. But he's not the most important. In a sense, he's the accidental president. If Tom Clark had accepted the offer from his fellow conspirators in Holy Week, just before the Rising, he would have been president. He would have read the proclamation. And of course, the clue is in the proclamation itself. His is the first name, and it stands alone. That tells you a lot. Tom Clark he's the most senior member of this conspiracy. He's we call the old man of the revolution because he celebrated his 59th birthday just before the Rising. Connolly, I think, was 46 in 1916. All the others were in their 30s except for Plunkett, who was 29. So he's a veteran of the revolutionary movement, and a fascinating character, packed 6 lives into one. So fascinating that I spent 3.5 years researching and writing his life. My conclusion was that it is he who's the true leader of the Easter Rising. He had actually been in the IRB before Plunkett was born. So this is a man who literally devotes his entire life to one cause, the cause of revolution. But he's a man who lives in the shadows. And it's only in recent years that he has come out of the shadows. I'm not the only person who's written about Clark recently. It's a bit like London buses, you wait for a long while, then 3 come along at once. There's a good book by Helen Lytton, who's a member of the Clark Daly family, and she's terrific on on the family background. She's also the best indexer in Ireland, by the way. She indexed my book on Clark. And Gerard McAtasney has also written a book which is half biography and half of Tom's letters. Now, a brief background: a man lives in the shadows. And that's the way he wanted it. Indeed, until recently, it had been an established fact that he had been born in the Isle of Wight. He wasn't born in the Isle of Wight. He was born in County Tipperary in 1857 out of wedlock to a Protestant British Army soldier who was proud of the British Empire and a Catholic mother. He rejects his father's politics, but not his father. He commits himself to revolution, goes to America just ahead of arrest by the RIC after he had participated in a riot in Dungannon. In America, he joins the American Fenian organization Clan na Gael. And in 1881, he volunteers for a bombing mission. The Clan na Gael started to run a bombing campaign in London, designed to... dynamite was then regarded as the weapon of mass destruction. And he signed up for this campaign. Now, this bombing campaign was a ruthless one. It was designed to shock and awe and to force the British to give in within weeks, they hoped. Now, these bombs that were to go off were no warning bombs. The civilians would not be collateral damage. They were the targets. And the buildings, of course, that they inhabited, the London Underground, Houses of Parliament. in Clark's eyes, this was small beer compared to the crimes that he believed England committed in Ireland. But you have to say that anyone who's prepared to do that has got ice water in their veins. Clark's predominant characteristic was ruthlessness. The ends justified the means. The goal was an independent Ireland, and whatever you had to do, he was prepared to do. He's arrested before the bombing campaign can start. He's sentenced to prison, life imprisonment, and he's imprisoned in two prisons, Chatham Prison and Portland Prison in England. He does 15.5 years in terrible conditions. Especially the rule of silence. The prisoners were not supposed to talk to anyone at all, except occasionally if they wanted to convey something to a guard, they stood and put up their hand until recalled. Now, all his fellow conspirators who were arrested broke. All of them, I think, went mad eventually. Clark himself said, in the end, it will break you. Clark was the one person who did not break. The others were paroled out. A few of them ended up in insane asylums. Clark walked out of the prison gates 15.5 years later when he was amnestied, and looked at the London that he had tried to bomb and made a very simple decision. What was he going to do with the rest of his life? He was just going to start all over again. It brings out too, I think, the steel-like quality to this man. He marries soon afterwards a young lady from a Republican family in Limerick, goes to America, works for the Clan de Gael, becomes an editor of the Clan paper, Gaelic American. But then in the end of 1970, he comes back to Ireland with one goal. He's returned now. He's learned a lot. He's learned a lot from John Devoy, the head of the clan, and he comes back a very different person. This man has been transformed. There's a charisma about him. He's a leader. He looks and acts like a leader now, and he is a master manipulator, a brilliant conspirator. He had, of course, had 15.5 years to think about what went wrong with the first conspiracy that he got into. And he was determined now, first of all, he was going to recruit a group of young Turks, talented Republican leaders who meant business. The old gang who dominated the IRB, he was determined to clear out ruthlessly. He poses as their friend, and then when the moment's right, he just catapults them into oblivion. He regarded them as political dinosaurs, surplus to requirements. So he then populates the IRB with these young men. People like the person who becomes his closest political associate, Sean McDermott. And there's almost a father-son relationship there. Later on, they recruit people like in Kent, Patrick Pearse, McDonough, and Plunkett. It's a small group, but that's all he wants. Clark is super secret and super sensitive about any leakages. What he believes, he has evolved the cell system, which would be impervious to penetration. The less people knew, the better. So the hierarchy then, I think, it becomes Clark at the top, McDermott, and then the other three as kind of junior directors. If you think of it like a board of a company, the three are the junior directors. Clark is chairman of the board, and McDermott is his chief executive, the one who gets the things done for him. Alternatively, you can think of McDermott as Trotsky to Clark's Lenin. Now, these men, they're a very varied group. You've got a headmaster of school, you've got an academic who teaches English at UCD, you've got sort of a count. McDermott had been a tram conductor, gardener, barman, and Clark had been a foundry worker initially in New York. So it's you can see why, to some extent, it's been called the revolution of the intellectuals, because it has intellectuals in it, but it's one of the few revolutions where the intellectuals take the orders from the proletarians, and that's most unusual. Okay, but despite their differences, they had many things in common. They are ruthless. They've got energy. They've got drive. They have courage. They're all prepared to lay down their lives, and they have a dream. Clark dreamt the revolution during the day, probably dreamt it at night as well. Lawrence of Arabia described this cast of mind when he says this. Lawrence, of course, is essentially talking about himself, but it applies equally to this group of men. All dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of the mind wake up to find it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. And finally, they were all gamblers. For a group of men, a small group of men, to essentially take on the British Army, that's the gamble of all gambles. In a sense, they're like men going into the casino and staking everything on one spin of the wheel. But they reckoned without the gamble, you can't win. Okay, so there you have the men and the motives. But they need a means, of course. They need a weapon. They need a sword in their hands. They waited for that opportunity. The IRB alone could not be that weapon. It's been said that if you gathered all the members of the IRB together in 1914, they wouldn't have filled a moderately sized concert hall. What they need is for opportunities to break for them and then seize the day. And in 1914, 1913, that began to happen. At the end of at the end of 1913, as you know, the Irish Volunteers are formed during the Third Home Rule crisis in response to the Ulster Volunteer Force. And this takes off like wildfire. Eventually, the number of members rising to 180,000. Now, not all those members, by any means at all, were Republicans. They were mostly home rulers or of no political persuasion whatever. But Clark sees the potential. So right from the start, what he does is to infiltrate trusted, talented members of the IRB, most of whom he had handpicked and recruited over the previous years, and he begins inserting them, surreptitiously of course, into important positions in the Irish Volunteers. Now this is a silent coup in a sense. The person at the top of the Volunteers, the president of the Provisional Committee, is Owen McNeill, who is a professor of history at UCD. He's this subterranean work by Clark is largely unknown to McNeill, whatever McNeill's suspicions. But McNeill was ideal for Clark. A figurehead, respected, who could appeal to nationalists throughout Ireland and build up the volunteers. But he was ideal also for Clark in that McNeill was lazy. He was not politically sharp, and he was not hands-on at all. One critic said that he seemed to spend more time in the 13th century than the 20th. But for Clark, that was good. By the summer of 1914, the IRB is well entrenched. It's actually got a majority on the provisional committee of the volunteers. And then in June of 1914, there's a setback. John Redmond, the Home Rule Party leader, delivers an ultimatum. He's worried about the growing power and independence of the Irish volunteers. He gives it an ultimatum that if the provisional committee of the volunteers do not accept his controlling majority, he'll set up his own rival force. Now, McNeill accepted that. Clark was absolutely incandescent with rage, but he couldn't do anything about it. McNeill, with the support of Roger Casement, who was on the provisional committee as well, said unity is more important. Clark has to bite his tongue and just wait for more opportunities to arise when he can resume his path to revolution. And very soon afterwards, of course, it does happen, the outbreak of the First World War. The old adage, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, was certainly applicable here. In a sense, for years, Clark had been scouring the horizon, waiting for this to happen, and then in August 1914, the ship finally comes in, and he was absolutely euphoric. War, great. And there's something else about the war as it develops that Clark is very, very glad about. It's a long war. It develops into a long war of attrition. As you know, I'm sure, initially everyone thought, well, almost everyone thought, that the war would be over by Christmas. The Kaiser said the troops will be home before leaves fall from the trees. In England, it was known as the mince pie war because the boys would be home in time for their Christmas dinner. Clark is one of the few people for whom that would have been a disaster. Once it develops into a long-drawn war of attrition that is possibly going to go on for years, it gives him one vital commodity that he needed: time. Time to make his plans for a rising, time to look for foreign allies, and time to look for arms with which his men could fight in the coming rising. As you know, I think in September 1914, John Redmond splits the volunteers with a speech at Woodbridge in which he calls for Irish volunteers to go and fight when the firing line extends. That caused a split. Most Irish volunteers went with Redmond and formed the National Volunteers. A minority of Irish Republicans, of Irish volunteers, stay with McNeill. There's only eventually about 11,000 of them out of 180,000. But Clark does not regard that as a setback, because these are the 11,000 who can always be relied on to fight. Everyone who's in the Irish Volunteers accepted that at some point they would almost certainly have to fight England. Only the circumstances were a cause of difference between them. It might be a conscription crisis, something else, but these men would fight if it came to it. Now, Clark immediately gets to work. Whenever the Irish Volunteers established in December 1914 a general headquarters staff, properly officered, he inserts people like Pearse, Plunkett, MacDonagh and Kent into directors' positions, directors of organisation, director of training, director of recruitment. So he's got a real power base here with which he can manipulate the volunteers, and he is a master manipulator. And he also ensures that the commanders of the 4 Dublin battalions of the Irish Volunteers are commanded by trusted supporters of his as well. As I said, there were only 11,000 of them, but remember, they're in Dublin. Strongest in Dublin and in the west, where a possible arms shipment might most conveniently land. These are 2 key areas. It's like Lenin in Russia in 1917. The Bolsheviks are not strong in the countryside, only in Petrograd and in Moscow, but that's where the action was. So there's parallels there. In early 1915, he establishes what's called a military committee. Later becomes a military council. A 3-man committee: Plunkett, Pearse, and Kent. And their task is to do the paperwork for the rising. How are we going to get the troops, the volunteers, onto the streets? Where are they going to seize? What's the military strategy if the British react? So they are set to work. Now, what was the goal? Ever since 1916, there was a general acceptance that this was a blood sacrifice rising. There was no real hope of success. They would go out, they would make a brave, bloody stand, they would be arrested at the end of the rising, they would be shot for the cause, they would become heroes, and the people of Ireland would then rally to their cause. Now that's a post facto rationalisation. It didn't happen, but I don't think it happened like that. Tom Clark had not spent 15.5 years in a jail to emerge, and then, as he would have regarded, throwing it away in a glorious failure. Tom Clark's goal was the same goal that had been in 1798, the Fenian Rising of 1867, the end of British rule in Ireland. Clark's great historical hero was Wolfe Tone, and he adhered absolutely to Tone's goal of ending the English connection, the bane of everything that occurred in Ireland. Pearse certainly would have been attracted to the blood sacrifice idea, the fusion of Catholicism and nationalism, a glorious death for Ireland, etc., etc. But Pearse works for Clark. Clark does not work for Pearse. He works under the discipline of of Clark. So Clark keeps a tight lid on these exuberances that this religious exuberance that Pearce exhibited. Kathleen Clark recalled that just before the rising, she asked, well, if you win, what about Pearce? Do you think he'll be the man at the top? And he said, oh no, he's too Christ-like. We want someone like John Devoy, the American Clan na Gael leader, the 74-year-old Clan na Gael leader. He says, he's the man. We need someone with a touch of Cromwell, which is a fascinating allusion here. It gives the rather disturbing possibility that he thought that Ireland, a future Ireland, might be running the same dictatorial lines that Devoy ran the Clan na Gael in America. How much more have I got? Okay, 5 minutes? Oh dear, right. Right, speeding up. They do the nuts and bolts planning throughout 1915, but there's another aspect of the planning which is often forgotten. It's the psychological preparation that Clark indulges in. Throughout 1915, he hypes the mood in Ireland, stirring up anti-British antagonism and portraying the British government as the aggressor in Ireland. And the apogee of that is the O'Donovan Rossa funeral on the 1st of August 1915. Now that event is incredibly important. Everyone knows about Pearce's speech, but that's the crescendo to it, the whole event. Clark staked everything on it. O'Donovan Rossa, a long forgotten Fenian, dies in America, and that presents Clark with a wonderful opportunity. He said, brilliant, he couldn't have died at a better time for us. So the body's brought back to Ireland, and he stakes everything on organising a great funeral. On that day, Sunday the 1st of August, Dublin looks like a foreign state. Certainly it's not a city, it doesn't look like a city in the United Kingdom. Troops and soldiers, and policemen disappear off the streets. Tricklers everywhere, hundreds of thousands of spectators, the largest funeral that Dublin had ever seen. A procession takes about an hour to pass any given point, goes to Glasnevin. You have armed, first time armed Irish volunteers marching in the procession, and at the cemetery Glasnevin, Pearce makes this great speech, which I'm sure you're all acquainted with. Now that speech is again part of the psychological preparation. It's a call to arms. It's a great speech whether you agree with its sentiments or not, and it's delivered brilliantly. I often think of it as the Irish equivalent of the St. Crispian's Day speech in Henry V, the Band of Brothers speech. And what he's saying is, essentially, there will be a fight, get ready. And of course, Clark, who organised the entire thing, staked everything on it, he runs off by organising the volley of shots fired over the grave. In January 1916, another brilliant decision by Clark. He brings on board James Connolly, who's threatening to upset everything, brings him on board, gets Clark, and appoints him as the Dublin commander of the rebel forces. And that was Clark's brilliant insight into opportunities. He could easily have crushed Connolly in the Citizen Army. No, he made use of them. In January 1916, also the Germans come on board with a promise to deliver an arms shipment. So between then and April of 1916, everything is just gearing up. The plans are ready. and then everything goes wrong right at the last moment. McNeill, I think, as you know, backs out. He issues a cancellation order, which devastation is not the word, it's not an adequate enough word to describe the impact on Clark. Clark only cried 3-4 times in his adult life. This was the third time, just broke down in tears. He regarded McNeill as having betrayed him. Of course, he'd spent years betraying McNeill, but I suppose people who run rings around other people, they're not too happy when someone else does to them. So they decide that they have to go ahead. They wouldn't have been the men that they were if they had backed out and meekly accepted McNeill's decision. McNeill went to bed on the 22nd after having issued his countermanding order, the happiest man in the world. He thought he had checkmated them. What he forgot was that in real life, unlike in chess, the game continues after checkmate. Clark was not out of moves. And if I can find it quickly, it was no, it was an account by MacDonald's brother, which essentially says, you know, they couldn't have looked in, they had to go on. It's at that moment that all the carefully planned Easter rising fell apart. When they went out on Easter Monday, it's now no longer carefully planned, it's a leap in the dark. They just, and they just hope that they can land somehow on their feet. What I think Clark envisage is now on Easter Monday, get the thing going and hope it's like throwing a match into a barrel of gunpowder and the whole thing will explode. And then if the nation rallies to us, we can still win. Clark believed right to the end that somehow they could still win. Even in Moore Street, when they surrendered, the provisional government members took a vote, and Clark was the only person who voted to continue the struggle, almost as if he believed by sheer strength of will he could still rally the nation. But that was the man. He had never changed. He'd always been like that, and he remained that way until his death. Okay, that's it.
Pleased to speak on the topic. This is a stamp issued by the Irish government to commemorate the centenary of Cumann in 1914 and 2014. And the woman there is Teresa Shields from Fork Hill. She's on the horse and cart, and this is Cumann at the commemorating the killing of people at Bachelor's Walk after the Hoth gun running in 1914, to show that both that Cumann was there at the beginning, women who were marching are Cumann activists, some of them were wearing white feathers to demonstrate the anger of people at the killing of civilians, but also to show that although it's a Dublin-centred rising, not everyone was from Dublin, that there were people who had moved from other parts of Ireland and were also involved. And before I go on to Cumann and the role of women in the rising, just to say that nationalist women had been active for a long time before that, and particularly with the formation in 1900 of the Nini na HÉireann, Daughters of Erin, which had been formed by Maud Gonne. And as to trace from what Michael had been talking, Maud had been very active in the campaign to free the treason felony prisoners, the Amnesty Association. She visited the prisoners, she campaigned on their behalf, and Tom Clark was the last one to be released. They had a paper, Ban na Heron, which went for 3 years. It was called the paper that all the young men also read, and Helena Maloney, the editor of it, talked about it being a mixture of guns and chiffon. And it always talked about street fighting, militancy, insurrection, always took the path of physical force. So when Cumann na mBan is formed, some of the women in Anini don't join Cumann na mBan. They're very much feminist activists. They join the Irish Citizen Army because they say James Connolly, always a feminist, believed in the equality of their sexes. But Anini does become a branch of Cumann na mBan. Now, Cumann na mBan isn't formed until April 1914, but as we heard from Michael, the Irish Volunteers is formed in November 1913 as a response to Carson and the Ulster Volunteer Force. So there's 5 months before women are formed into a nationalist organisation. And at the volunteer meeting, it was just said from the platform that there would be work for women to do, but it wasn't clear what kind of work this would be and whether women indeed would have an organisation in which to do this work. Quite a few, the volunteers, was a mixture of parliamentarians, some men with very conservative views, also men with radical views who also supported suffrage. But a lot of them didn't want women to be in organisation, they didn't want women to be involved in the volunteers. So it took 5 months of nationalist women working behind the scenes before Cumann na mBan eventually appeared. And like Owen McNeill, the figurehead in the Irish Volunteers, they had a figurehead as well. They had Agnes Farrelly, who was in fact a colleague of Owen McNeill's, also a teacher in University College, and a woman of quite conservative views. Now, luckily for Cumann na mBan, I think, she doesn't stay with the organisation in the way that Owen McNeill does. She leaves at the time of the Redmond split. But as the organisation has its inaugural meeting, her conception of what women are going to do shows a very conservative notion of women's capabilities, and what their political participation is really, she sees, an extension of their domestic responsibilities. She says, "We shall do ourselves the honour of helping to arm and equip our national volunteers. Each rifle we put in their hands will represent to us a bolt fastened behind the door of some Irish home to keep out the hostile stranger. Each cartridge will be a watchdog to fight for the sanctity of the hearth." Now, there are young women who were at that meeting who came away saying, I don't want to go back there, I didn't agree with what she says. Louise Gavin Duffy says, "We didn't think her ideas advanced enough." Nancy Wise-Power, the daughter of Jenny Wise-Power, a long-standing Irish national figure, member of the Sinn Féin executive, had been a member of Anini na Heron, indeed had also been part of the Ladies' Land League. Well, her daughter says, "Oh, I didn't join until 1915. At that time, their programme didn't appeal to me, but from the trend of events, I felt a desire to belong to some organised body." So there was a lot of tension in the formation of Cumann na mBan, and that tension, in fact, revolves around its first aim to the cause of Irish liberty. What did Irish liberty mean at a time when Irish women didn't have the vote? And they were asked about that. The suffragettes came to the meetings and would stand up and say, "Do you mean women will have citizenship in this new Ireland? Do the Irish Volunteers support women having the vote?" Because at this time we also had a very militant suffrage organisation, and women were going to jail for the fight for the vote. But Irish women were organised in furtherance of the object, and they were going to assist in arming and equipping a body of Irish men for the defence of Ireland and form a fund for the purposes. And they were called things by the feminists like animated collecting boxes for the men and other even ruder epithets, and there was a lot of discussion about that. But 2 women from the north also attended the first meeting of Cumann Winifred Carney, who worked with James Connolly in the Irish Textile Workers Union, and I think Connolly's daughter, Ina, his 4th child. And branches of Cumann began to be formed. There was the Anini branch, but Kathleen Clark was very active. She was a member of the central branch of Cumann, but I just wanted to show you that at the same time as Cumann is formed, we still have suffrage protests, we still have women in jail, and that's Hannah Shees Geffington speaking outside Mountjoy Jail. As I say, some of the women joined the citizen army instead, but this is Cumann, its poster. Women joined the movement, and this is what they could do: learn first aid, ambulance classes, drill, rifle practice, and also the equipment fund. Now, the right to use firearms becomes really a signifier for those who believe that women have an equal right to take part in the fight. The women who joined the Citizen Army, Constance Markovich, Margaret Skinner, Helena Maloney, Kathleen Lynn, and a whole load of other women who we'll hear about who take part in the rising, they are there and they're learning how to, they go on route marches with the men, they learn how to fire guns like the men do. This isn't the same in Cumann. What Cumann are doing is learning how to unload weapons, how to clean them in order to support the men. It's not envisaged that they will also be firing in the way that men are doing. But some are different, and Belfast Cumann is very different. A Belfast branch starts very soon after the movement starts, and the evidence there by, for example, Elizabeth Corr and Nora and Ina Connolly is that they saw women's role as being very equal to that of men. Elizabeth Corr, this is Cumann marching at the O'Donovan, I think it's not at the O'Donovan Rossa funeral as we heard, but you had women in their uniform by then taking part in full uniform. But Elizabeth Corr talks about the, as the war starts in Belfast, the pro-British sentiment, she says, completely sickens them, and they decide they want to do something. Their brother Henry is in the volunteers, and they decide that they're going to be in Cumann. So 2 of the Corr family, the 2 of the women are in Cumann. One of the brothers is in the volunteers, but 2 of the men, as the war starts, join the Australian forces and the Canadian forces, and this is their grave in Belfast, and George, one of the brothers, dies at the Somme. So we have in that one family the complexity of Belfast and the north. But Elizabeth talks about the fact that they were prepared to fight, and that was their reason for joining Cumann. They didn't only engage in how to look after arms, they also engaged in rifle practice. They went out to the Divis Mountains and challenged the volunteers to shooting competitions. And they said that they were about to move on to moving targets with small arms the week before the rising started. So it was very clear that they saw themselves as having a very active role. So there were about 30 activists in the Belfast branch. I just wanted to say a little bit about them, because our concentration on Dublin means we often lose the northern perspective. And the Belfast branch were going to take part in the rising. They were going to go from Belfast to Coal Island to meet up with the volunteers from Tyrone, and they were all then supposed to go to Galway to meet up with Liam Mellows. Not I think the most feasible of plans, but that was the plan. They got to Coal Island, they heard of the countermanding orders, and they were told to go back to Belfast. And the women, there were 6 women at this stage who'd gone to the first lot of the volunteers. They were supposed to go in 3 train loads so as not to arouse too much suspicion that so many nationalists were travelling from Belfast to Coal Island. So those 6 women said, we can't go back to Belfast. Nora and Ina Connolly said, we certainly can't. Our father's in Dublin, we know what he's doing. We're going down to Dublin to tell them what's happening, to tell them of the disarray in the north. And so they managed to get from Portadown a midnight train and went down to Dublin, arrived there at 5 in the morning on Easter Saturday night, and were able to say, they were then sent out to Plunkett, to McDonagh and to the other leaders to tell them to quickly come into Liberty Hall. There was an urgent meeting about the countermanding orders and how to regroup, and obviously then they start on Easter Monday instead. But the girls see the proclamation hot off the press, the ink's still wet, and they're told to memorise it, to go back up north. They can't bring a copy of the proclamation, it's too dangerous, but they go back up to the north to try and regroup. They find then that the volunteers have disbanded from Coal Island, but for example, Roisin Walsh, who was also a member of Belfast Cumann but comes from Clogher, she's there with her family working with the volunteers who are hiding in the hills around Clogher at the time. So I think that when we talk about who's involved in Easter Week, we need to also include that small group from Belfast Cumann. And of course there is the most famous woman of all from Belfast, Winifred Carney, who the week before the rising gets a message, a telegram from Connolly saying, come down to Dublin now, I need you. And she is the one who types up the mobilisation orders. She's the one who marches to the GPO armed with a revolver and her typewriter, and all those countermanding orders that then mobilisation orders put out, and also the notice of surrender, all of those, and the notices that the messages that Connolly writes during the rising, the text of war news, the paper they produced during the rising, that's Winifred Carney's role, and she continues with that. But we have, as I said, women from the Citizen Army who worked with the men, and this is some of the young women of Citizen Army drilling, and at the far right you can see women like Constance Markievicz looking on at the women. And you have 250 to 300 women all together take part in the rising, and there are about 30 women from the Citizen Army. And that number of women taking part in the rising seems to have increased in the last few months as more and more of the evidence and witness statements come online, or as families have been doing research into their family relatives. When I was doing research in the 1970s and early 80s, so many people said they thought an aunt or a grandmother or somebody was involved, but nobody had bothered to ask. Nobody really talked about things. And I think one of the great successes of the centenary commemorations has been that across Ireland, people have been looking to see what has happened, who was involved in their families, and so much more information has come out, and come out particularly, I think, on women. I think that's one of the reasons we've had so much more concentration on what women have done. Now, a significant number of the women who took part in the rising were teachers, clerical workers, shop assistants, seamstresses, nurses, students, some of them very young. But you also had women of a certain age. I mean, the Corps sisters, for example, one of them was a typist in the Belfast Central Library. Other members of Cumann were teachers in St Mary's. So you had women with a certain degree of economic independence from their families, able to do what they wanted to do. The women of the Citizen Army, you have Constance Markievicz, but on the right you have Kathleen Lynn, a Protestant doctor from County Mayo, who is completely disowned by her family but for what she's doing. But it's striking how the experience of the 1913 lockout creates a generation of revolutionaries in Dublin, and so many of the participants of the rising are those who have been affected by the lockout, the women who went on strike for trade union rights and then lost their jobs, particularly the women of Jacob's Biscuit Factory, which was the main employer for working class women in Dublin. And we can see that, for example, in the City Hall during the rising, there were 9 members of the Citizen Army or women in that garrison. We have Helena Maloney, who had been in Anini Naheran, the editor of their paper, but you also had Kathleen Lynn in the Citizen Army, And when Sean Connolly, who was the commandant, was shot and killed, she was the most senior officer there. But 3 of the women had been workers in Jacob's biscuit factory: Jenny Shanahan, Bridget Brady and Bridget Davis. And there was Annie Norgrove, who was a working class Protestant. Her father was a gas fitter, a trade unionist. He was a lieutenant in the Citizen Army. He was out in the Rising as well. So was her mother and her sister. And her mother was in the Jacobs factory garrison. But Annie talked about being on the roof of the City Hall with shelling from nearby Dublin Castle. She said the bullets hopped like hail off the chimney pots, and the chimney pots smashed in smithereens around me. Kathleen Lynn said the bullets fell like hail around them as well. No, like rain, she calls it. But she took the surrender. That garrison didn't last very long, and she took the surrender as the most senior figure. And when she surrendered, the British presumed that the women were hostages, not combatants. They couldn't believe these were the first women that they had come across in the Rising. It was the first garrison to be captured and to have to surrender. So they met Jenny Shanahan on the first floor, and she told them, when they asked her, were there any more there? She said hundreds on the roof. So they were able to hold out for a little bit longer, as the British forces didn't want to go up there. And Jenny said later the soldiers were very angry at the way they'd been tricked by the women. But you also had in Stephen's Green, and later on in the College of Surgeons, when they moved from Stephen's Green, you had Constance Markievicz, but you also had Margaret Skinner, a Scottish teacher whose family was from County Monaghan, and she came over from Scotland to, as she says, do my bit for Ireland. And she argues, when she's there with Michael Mallon, that the proclamation gives her the right to take an equal part, to be militarily active, and that's her on the right dressed as a man. But she is a Red Cross nurse during the Rising, but then she takes off the Red Cross uniform and puts on her Citizen Army uniform that Constance Markievicz has had made for her, and she takes part militarily, and she gets badly wounded when she leads a raiding party to dislodge snipers. There was also women like Rosie Hackett there. She was again another Jacobs worker who'd lost her job, and she becomes a full-time revolutionary in Liberty Hall working with the Women Workers Union. And she's the one who carries the text of the proclamation to the printers and prevents the police raiding Liberty Hall before the Rising. She was a first aider, but it really doesn't do justice to her to say that that's what her role was. She narrowly escaped death more than once. And on the anniversary of Connolly's death in May 1917, she was one of the women who put the banner, James Connolly murdered, 12th of May 1916, across Liberty Hall and defended it against the police coming to try and rip it down. And I think that's very symbolic, because it's certainly for the year after the Rising, when you had thousands of men in places like Fromgoch, it was the women who kept the idealism and the flame of the Rising alive. Later on, Cathal Brewer talks about it was the women who kept the flame alive and the Rising and the spirit of the Rising. So 12 women were arrested in Stephen's Green later on. But I just want to say that the proclamation of the Republic is so significant, particularly for women, that it starts off talking and addressing Irish men and Irish women and giving them equal rights and equal opportunities. This is at a time when, in 1913, the Irish volunteers wouldn't say that they agreed with women having the vote. 3 years later, they're talking about promising equal suffrage to all citizens. And Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, when she goes to America later on, says it's the first time in history that men fighting for freedom voluntarily included women, and makes the point that the American Declaration of Independence was addressed to men. The French Revolution, with its stress on fraternity, even though there were women involved in the French Revolution, it wasn't about giving women citizenship. And so historically, the Irish Proclamation is so significant, and it predates what happens with the Russian Revolution. Now, the Marrowbone Lane is one of the outpost I find most interesting, because it's Marrowbone Lane, Jameson's distillery. There you've got 40 volunteers and 25 Cummin women, and it's under the command of Con Colbert, a former Fianna member and a young man in his early 20s. And you can see all the testimony from this one, how close they are, they're close they are friendship, but close in terms of them understanding that women had a pretty equal role if women wanted to play that role. So in this one, they were protecting Eamon Kant's position in the South Dublin Union, and they had snipers, and each sniper in Marylebone Lane had one woman with them keeping watch and reloading the guns, and they did this day after day. But they had real problems with food supplies, as most of the garrisons had. I think that's one of the ways you can see that the revolution was planned by men and didn't have a woman's hands in it. Rose McNamara in the Marrowbone Lane distillery says that they had to become highway robbers. They commandeered a bread van, 28 chickens, 3 cows, a load of cabbage and 2 vats of milk, God forgive us, she added. They had a butcher, so they were able to get the cows butchered, and she talked about taking the chickens out of pots with bayonets because they didn't have any forks or utensils for cooking. And just thinking about that experience of a young woman suddenly becoming a highway robber, and just all your conceptions of your normal role being completely overturned. And all of those 25 women refused to slip away before the surrender. Most of the commandants said to them, "Go away, girls, you'll unman the men if you get arrested with them." They all said, "No, we fought with you all week, we will go with you." And they marched together with the men of the 4th Battalion to the Richmond Barracks, and then were moved to Kilmainham Jail. But sometimes I think that the most common experience might have been somebody like young Catherine Byrne, a 20-year-old woman who ends up in the GPO. Now she lives in very near the GPO in North Dublin, and finds that her brother's already gone. She's got a very sympathetic mother who just says, "Well, go after your brother, go after the men." So she goes and follows them and ends up at the GPO and isn't allowed in. And in fact, that the most senior officer she can find says, "Go away or I'll tell your brother." So she says, what does she do? She hung around until she found someone to help her. She said, "I asked Frank Murtagh to lift me up to the side window at the corner where the stamp machine is now, and he did this with the aid of another volunteer, and I kicked in the glass of the window. I jumped in and landed on Joe Gahan." And there's a very good book now by Lucy McDermott, At Home in the Revolution, and she uses that example, as she called it, a dramatic entry into revolutionary space, to symbolise the difficulty that many women had in actually getting into the outpost, because the women weren't mobilised at the same time as the men, with all the confusion of the countermanding orders. Cummin was kind of forgotten about, and a lot of the women talk about their experience of wandering around, going to the Sinn Féin offices, wondering where they can go, meeting some other women. Somebody says, "Well, I saw Tom McDonough, I know him, let's go and ask him if we can go join him." And he says, "Well, we haven't made any provision for you girls." And they say, "Well, we can help." And so he says, "Oh, come on in then." And famously, the only one he doesn't let women in at Boland's Mill is Eamon de Valera, who says it's no place for women, go away. And later on says he's sorry he did that because it meant some of his best men had to act as cooks. But the role of messenger, I think, is where women really stand out. It's a very dangerous role, and it becomes increasingly dangerous as the week goes on, as they have to dodge barricades and bullets on the street. And a lot of the women give testimony of their role as messenger. Leslie Price in the GPO calls it the most miserable job, said she nearly cried every time she was told to go out again. But she said that she'd done such a good job, they promoted her to an officer. And I'm kind of appalled that the GPO had an officer's table, an officer's mess, and she was able to sit there because of her role. But finally, by the Friday, with gunboat Helga firing away across the Liffey, and barricades all round, Pearse calls the women in the GPO together and asks them to leave. There are about 25 to 30 women, and they all protest. They say, "You told us we're all equal. What about women's rights?" And Pearse cannot deal with women at all, so he goes away, and other people have to come and calm the women down. And eventually, a first group of 20 leave, and by the end of the day, the remaining 15 are forced to leave this burning garrison. Now, Julia Grennan and Elizabeth O'Farrell are kept in the GPO to look after the injured Connolly, and Winifred Carney is also needed as she's there to type the messages, including a message of surrender and all the others. So that's Elizabeth O'Farrell, and that's the very famous photograph of surrender as they surrender to General Lowe, and you can see Elizabeth's skirt and shoes beside Pearse. And apparently she said when the photo was about to be taken that she stepped back, not wanting to be in the photo, feeling it was a very important occasion, and as a mere woman, I guess, she felt she shouldn't be there, and then later said she regretted it. And we have all those other photos where the photo is tidied up and you can't see her at all, you can only see Pearse, and you know, that's symbolised for many women, the women being written out of history. But as that last group leaves the GPO, it said that Winifred Carney bent over Connolly's stretcher, shielding his body as he's been carried across. And on surrender, Julia Grennan and Winifred Carney are the two who march out with the rest of the men to the grass in front of the rotunda, because that's where they all of the prisoners were brought into a tiny little grass area, very cold night, and it was far too small for them. Julia Grennan wrote that Carney had Connolly's greatcoat. He didn't need it. He was being stretchered off to hospital. He'd given her his coat. So she spread it and her own coat onto the grass and insisted that Sean McDermott and James Plunkett sat and had, says Julia, a little warmth and rest, because they were two who were very frail physically. So I think it shows a picture of Winifred as an incredibly unflappable woman who has done, performed a role in extreme circumstances, but never loses her humanity and care for other people. So it's clear that women played a huge variety of roles in the Rising. I just wanted to put this in. I just feel it has to be marked that Hannah She Skeffington on the left, her husband Frank, a pacifist who was trying to stop looters during the Rising, is then killed by a British Army officer, and that's her and her sister trying to find out what's happened. And ironically enough, her sister's husband, Tom Kettle, then gets killed at the Somme a couple of months later. But that's the women of Easter Week getting together the following summer, some of the women of Easter Week, and they're the ones who keep the ideals of the Rising going, motivated not only by nationalism but by socialism, and many of them by feminism. And after that watershed, Cumbernaman feels free to include a new aim in its constitution, to follow the policy of the Republican Proclamation by seeing that women take up their proper position in the life of the nation. And from now on, they say, any funds to be collected were to be for the arming and equipping of the men and women of Ireland. So women start joining Cumbernaman in really significant numbers. By 1917, there are 100 branches. By 1918, there are 600. And we can see Constance Markievicz being taken away as a prisoner, but she's the last prisoner to be released, coming back to an ecstatic welcome to Ireland. You have women being extremely active in the movement to make sure the conscription isn't imposed on Ireland. And then you have, at the end of the war, the election of 1918, when you have Constance Markievicz elected in Dublin, and you have Winifred Carney unsuccessful in East Belfast, but two women chosen because they were both out and took very active parts in the Rising. And the Irish Citizen now, after all the disagreement between the feminists and women of Cumbernaman earlier, they now say Ireland leads the way, and while Britain wallows in reaction and turns her back on women MPs, Ireland proudly writes progress on her banner to show the world how much in advance she is of those who would try to rule her. Of course, I don't want to go on any further than that. That's women's role in the Rising and the immediate aftermath. Women are also active. They become part of the executive of the newly formed Sinn Féin. What happens afterwards in the post-revolutionary period is something else again. Thank you.